Well, hello, everyone. Today, you have me, your co-host, Tina Freitas, and not Nick Freitas, because he's on a plane flying back from Vegas right now. He went out there.
That's Nate with our soundboard.
He went out to Nevada in order to have a conversation with Misha Tate on her podcast, and he also had a conversation with Iced Coffee Hour. And they are flying back now. And today, so since he's not with us, you've got me, and you've also got Christian.
I'm here.
Yes, and I don't do the introductions quite the same way Nick does. But today we are talking about whether or not women have totally gone off the rails. I mean, women have gone crazy. They're voting so far to the left. We've got this situation now where people are concerned about the direction the country is going and society is going because women are going so far to the left. And this isn't just an American phenomenon. This is happening all over the place. And today we're going to talk about, are women going crazy? And if you look at the data, actually they are pretty mentally ill, especially on the left, which is really interesting, that their voting habits and their mental illness seem to go hand in hand. But I also want to talk today about whether or not the way the female brain is hardwired makes us more susceptible to falling for certain things within the left. And so we're going to kind of break some of that down today and talk about it. And I'm just going to be honest with you. I struggle to have any goodwill whatsoever toward the left in general nowadays. And especially toward leftist women. And so I'm going to try to keep my disgust to a minimum as we tackle these issues. And so we're going to start off by talking about whether or not women are predisposed to being manipulated by the left because of the way our brains work. And now you can talk to people on the left, and there's very much blurring of the lines with the genders right now, as you know. And so if you talk to folks on the left, it's like they want to pretend that there's no difference whatsoever between men and women within their brains, let alone their bodies. I mean, there's no difference. It's okay. You can have a penis even and be a woman. I mean, there's a lot to it. And so we're going to go ahead and pull up a chart. Christian, do you have that first link to pull up?
Yes, I do. So, hi everybody. It's just Tina and I. And here is this is the first thing that I want to get across.
Yeah.
So we're going to set the stage here. We're talking about why does it seem like that so many women are on the left. So Tina and I were doing some researching last night and a few days before that for today's podcast. And some of the stuff that we uncovered I think was kind of interesting. The first thing that I've got here is actually a blog post talking about the over-feminization of academia and how that's seeped into the rest of the pop culture and just the broader culture at large. And there's this one paragraph here that I definitely want to read across. It says, one of her ideas, this is talking about an author who was trying to answer some of the same questions, was that social strategies work well in war, like organizing unrelated males, fighting for other groups overtly according to rules, and then reconciling after battle. Women have a social strategy that works well for protecting their individual health and the health of their children, emphasizing safety, covertly undermining the status of unrelated females, and excluding rivals rather than reconciling with them. Now, there's a few other points in here that we're actually going to get to at the end of the podcast, where we're going to talk in depth of what does this mean? Like, what are the implications of this? Mm-hmm. But the broader point, and I think it's a well-taken point, is that, believe it or not, sex is not a social construct. Gender is not a social construct. There are real substantive differences between men and women, and it's not just physical. Mm-hmm. It's not as if women are a man's brain just in a different type of body that doesn't have as much, upper body strength, right? Or that, men have a woman's brain, but they can't bear children. No, there's like real psychological differences between men and women and how they view the world, how they address challenges, how they cope with certain things, and how they tackle day-to-day life.
Yeah, I feel like you can really see that whenever how many news articles have you seen and videos have you seen of trans people, trans women, women with penises, basically.
No, men.
Okay. So how many times have you seen those people punch somebody out violently? They resort to violence. Well, actually, that's a man trait. That's a male trait. That's how men deal with things, is they deal with their aggression through violence. So that's kind of how you can know that, no, you're not a woman trapped in a man's body, because you're doing exactly what a man would do if he was angry or offended. So you're not a woman. And so go ahead. I'll let you finish.
No,
your point.
I think that you're right. Like look, men and women address things differently, and that plays itself out in like the workplace. One of the things that we're going to get to in today's podcast is like, how many women are working on the boats, catching crab off the coast of Alaska, right? How many women are working on the oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico? Like, there's certain occupations that have an overwhelming predominance of men to women, not because of patriarchy, right? But because we're different people. We're different types of humans. We're both humans, but we view the world differently in some ways. We operate differently in some ways. We have different strengths and weaknesses. And for a long time, I would argue for thousands of years, we had a very easy solution to this, which was a complementary solution. Men and women are meant for each other. I mean, this is like one of the opening lines in Genesis within the first chapter, right? It's not enough, for you to be alone. I'll make a helper for you. And like it's been so deeply ingrained into our culture and our history and our consciousness for so long that men and women are meant for each other. And then something crazy has happened over the last, some people might say over the last 10 years with the Great Awakening. Other people might say over the last like 50 or 60 years with what Nick calls modern feminism, which I know, Andrea, you're probably listening to this and you're probably upset when we use the phrase modern feminism. And so other people like her might say, no, it's like been the past 100 years or 150 years going all the way back to original feminism. But the point is that no matter where you draw that line, at some point in the process, things changed. We went from this complementary nature of men and women needing each other and deserving each other and working alongside each other.
Like a partner, like a partnership.
Exactly. That's what marriage is. And we went from that to, dare I say it, we've now overly feminized everything within society. And then we've wondered why women don't seem to actually be happy with the fact that everything's overly feminized. Men are increasingly being excluded or discriminated against. And again, we have examples of this that we're going to show. And everything seems to start falling apart. Like, you have an explosion of mental illness now that's gripping young women more than anybody else. You have a growing gender divide within our politics that historically was not the case even 50 years ago. Like, there's so many examples of the breakdown of that complementary nature not ultimately serving either men or women for that matter.
Right. It is really interesting too, because if you talk to people in society right now, even among conservative circles, there is this taboo about bringing up anything negative about women. And we kind of want to, pretend that there are no differences, and we don't treat women differently. We treat everybody exactly the same, and everybody deserves the same treatment. And what that tends to be is we treat everyone like females or defective females, one or the other. There is no treating each other, the way that people used to, in order to maintain respect and maintain an orderly society. Now it is just, blank slate. Nobody has any differences. And if you bring up any differences, you're a sexist. It's a bad thing to bring up differences. And if you criticize women in any way, any woman in any way, then you're just a bigot and you're a terrible human being. And so, and we see that even in more conservative circles. Like, a lot of us as conservative women, we kind of like to tout ourselves as not being easily offended, you don't have to treat me differently. I'm not so easily offended. I can handle it and all of that. But really, in reality, when you dig down to it, men treat each other very differently than women do. And we don't like it very much when we're truly treated like a man. And if you're truly treated like a man, chances are you're bringing some kind of a complaint to HR about the way you were treated because you feel like you were singled out or something. Well, in reality, he's just treating you like he treats the guys. And you said you wanted that, but apparently you didn't. And so now it's one of those things where it's like, okay, well, we want to be treated differently, but we don't want to know we're being treated differently. We want you to handle us carefully without us knowing that you're handling us carefully. So really, it's like we want you to beef up our ego and be like, oh, you're not like other women. You're so easy to get along with. And we have to pretend that we don't want to be treated differently, right?
So the obvious question is, why is that? And it's easy to just simply say, well, because women are different than men. But
we are different.
I want to get into like why that's the case. And this will ultimately lead us to a discussion that Nick and Rudyard have had before about the GSR tactics.
Yes.
And apparently there's more stuff to it. But before I jump into that, the other day I was listening to, it wasn't the other day, it was a couple months ago, but I was listening to, I think it was Jordan Peterson talking about some of these sex differences. And, you know, Peterson usually talks in very allegorical terms. He's very into like archetypes and stuff like that. And so like the way that he might address this is differently than the way that other people might address it. But the analogy that he used was solar and lunar concepts, which is actually a very ancient way of looking at men and women. And the way that this argument goes is that men tend to be, again, in Petersonian terms or in Jungian terms, men tend to be more of like a solar archetype. So what that means is that men get fulfillment and achievement by going out and conquering something. And I don't mean like physically by violence, but I mean like conquering nature, overcoming it, building something, achieving something. There's a famous quote by actually a female professor. I cannot remember her name off the top of my head, which is totally my fault. But there's a quote where she said, the same reason you don't have a female Einstein is the same reason you don't have a female Jack the Ripper. Because nature takes more chances on men. And it does that on purpose because the point of men is to go out there and tame the wilderness. It's to go out there and build civilization. And then Peterson continues and he says, well, by the same token, women represent this lunar archetype. And so what this means is that their fulfillments, their achievements come from their relationship to other people. And so it's not about taming the wilderness. It's about raising children. It's about being a mother. And so your achievement is not just tied to yourself or like what you can build with your hands or what you can go conquer, but instead it's, can you raise the next generation to succeed you, basically?
Right. And what you're saying right now is so taboo. To put any extra value on the creation and nurturing of human life, which is something uniquely feminine, uniquely something only women can do. Just highlighting that's an amazing thing, and that our makeup and our minds are kind of geared toward doing that well. That alone, that'll just get you canceled nowadays.
Well, so this leads to some really interesting implications, because even the people that are rebelling against the traditional gender roles actually are rebelling against it within the confines of traditional gender roles. Because let me explain what I mean. Because men and women get fulfillment in life, ultimate fulfillment, through different mechanisms, right? Again, it's men, it's what can you achieve? What can you achieve? What can you build? Women, it's relational to other beings. It's how are you as a wife, or how are you as a mother? Your success is tied to your children, or your success is tied to your husband, which is a very unpopular thing to say nowadays, but historically that is how men and women have viewed things. Again, it goes back to Peterson's point about these solar and lunar archetypes. What this means is that there's some interesting implications, because if your success and your fulfillment as an individual is tied to your relationship to your children or your relationship to your spouse, what that means is that the way that you cope with the world, the way that you tackle the world is going to be very different. This is where you get what Rudyard from What If Alt His brings up with his GSR strategy. And we actually have a tweet here that actually goes a little bit further beyond GSR.
Right. Well, this is dealing with, okay, so everyone has a different way to release aggression or to assert themselves aggressively. And for men, aggression is usually physical. It could be verbal too, but it's usually like men need to get that out in a physical way. And it's really interesting because with men, you can have a total blowout, and a lot of times the two guys walk away like on good terms. And it's because they've both increased in their respect for one another after the tussle. I mean, it's not always, but that's one of the reasons why boys can fight and then walk away, you know, be buddies and have a drink together. It's just the way it is. Women, not so much. The way that we do it, I was looking for the gossiping, shaming, and rallying. And then I stumbled upon this one that goes a little bit deeper, but I would say I don't have any disagreement with it at all. But it's the idea that women, when there is conflict and when they view somebody either as competition or they just simply don't like somebody or they have offended, you know, whatever. And oftentimes women will take offense for somebody else. So I get more angry about what people say about Nick than I do about what people say about me.
Well, that goes back to what I was saying, that very deep down, women get fulfillment from their relationship to other people, and very deep down, men get their fulfillment from what can they achieve as an individual. Like, what can they go conquer? What can they go overcome? Can they overcome themselves? Can they conquer nature? And because we have different paths to seek fulfillment.
Well, security is extremely important to women.
Security becomes more important to women because your path to fulfillment is tied to another human being. And so you want to protect that other human being because your success as a mother is predicated on your ability to raise that child. If you lose that child, you're no longer a mother at that point. Right? And so what this inherently leads to, and this isn't a bad thing, it only becomes a bad thing once it seeps into politics. But what this inherently leads to is that the strategy that women have to protecting this most important element of their life leads to what Rudyard calls the GSR. And somebody actually in the chat asked what this is. I'm glad that you asked. We can actually go through it in this tweet here. So for our audio listeners that might not be able to see the tweet, what this is it's actually elaborating a little bit more on GSR. It says that, what does GSRM stand for? There's a few other letters here. And this goes on to say, the female competitive strategy by circumventing argument by use of undermining, poisoning the well, reputation destruction by use of gossiping, shaming, rallying, ridicule, moralizing, psychologizing, undermining, reputation destruction, and solving for face or consent instead of male strategy by factual argument solving for truth regardless of face or consent. In other words, female feels using rejection or approval versus male reals of truth or falsehood. So I mean, and then it lists the full list, right?
Well,
Shaming, moralizing, psychologizing.
I want to back up real quick. Face or consent would basically be, do you appear to agree with this? Are you on my side, right? It's like, do I give off the appearance that I am in line with the correct thing, right?
The way that I would describe it is, the question that's being asked is not, is this true? The question that's being asked is, am I going to pay any sort of social consequence for saying this thing is true? And that's a totally different mindset.
Which is one of the reasons why women tend to, if you just look at the fact that women tend to be the biggest supporters of this whole trans ideology thing, they can see something that's true right in front of their face and still say it's not true. And you know it's not true. It's another reason why you will see women, like, let's say on the whatever podcast, and they will go around the table and every single one of them says they're a 10. And one of them will say, Lizzo's a 10. And we all know Lizzo ain't no 10, you know? Like, she might be to someone, but not in general. And I'm sure she has wonderful qualities, but the way you know for sure if a woman thinks another woman is a 10 is, would you trade bodies with her? Would you trade looks with her? If you would not, and you don't count yourself as a 10, then you know she's not a 10, right? And so it's like women, they can say something that conflicts with reality to your face and just truly try to appear as though they believe it. They don't believe it. They know what's true and what's not true, but they're too afraid of their social standing being messed up or getting canceled or appearing as if they're not an ally or whatever it is to actually admit what's true and what's not true.
The way that I've heard it described is that they're putting on nonsense as a uniform. And so what this means is that, like, anybody can get anybody to say something that like they can actually defend with facts and logic and evidence, even if it's ultimately not true or if there's more context missing. But if you can get people to repeat absolute absurdities, right, that men can become women, for example.
Yeah.
If you can get them to say that and they say it with a straight face, well, you know that you own them at that point. Right. And so in some ways it's like anybody can believe the truth, but to get somebody to believe in something that is just patently absurd and insane
and fight for it
then
and get emotional,
you've got a loyal follower at that point if you can get somebody to repeat something that even they know deep down is incorrect.
Yeah. So and that kind of leads you to understand why mental illness is so high, is because if you are living in a reality that rejects what you see in front of your eyes, I mean, you're literally living in a gaslit reality. So you no longer truth cannot have any bearing. You have to always finagle and figure out how to make this other thing true for you. And that's concerning. Now, back to these GSR, gossip, shaming, rallying, and then this one has extra more to it. It's kind of like LGBTQ. It just kind of keeps growing.
Well, I think the reason that they added some of these other things is the full list that they've got here is shaming, moralizing, psychologizing, ridiculing, rallying, gossiping, propagandizing, undermining, and reputation destruction, solving for face approval or consent instead of truth. So these are all in pursuit of, how do I defend my social status, right?
Right.
How do I avoid
appear to be in agreement with the majority?
And can I actually say one other thing? This is always presented from a negative perspective, and rightfully so, because in today's climate, this is being used to destroy civilization right now. It is. But I want to say there's a reason why women, and this is a general statement, right? But there's a reason why women have adopted these approaches, and it's not just because women are physically not as strong as men on average. The reason why is because in a healthy society, a complementary society where men and women actually work together and they fulfill their roles as men and women, going back to the whole archetypal thing of, how do you achieve, how do you become the best man or the best woman you can possibly do? Well, do the type of thing that men and women are supposed to be doing. Within that type of society, an old school, dare I say it, an old school traditionalist society, one that existed well before feminism, one that existed well before the 20th century, these approaches are actually used to preserve the society rather than destroy the society. Because if you think about it, somebody once argued that, men build civilization or men build civilization, but women civilize men. These approaches can be used to deconstruct a civilization, but these approaches can also be used to keep men in check, to preserve that civilization and not let them turn into barbarians.
And it's also a way to keep your children in check. It's also a way to teach your children what is the social norm and what is socially acceptable. And if what's socially acceptable is what's true and what's honorable, then this works.
Yes.
But if it's not, then it doesn't work. And it's interesting because we bring this up as though like this is a totally now I think gossiping is always bad, but women do have a tendency to do it. And it's interesting because I have a whole bunch of links that I did not put up here with and they're all from the left talking about how gossiping is a good tool to use, and shaming people for gossiping is the problem. And it's really kind of interesting how it's like, no, this is how we keep everything in check. This is how we keep things in line. Well, I mean, that's true to a degree, but if you're doing it in pursuit of something that isn't the truth or isn't morally right, then it's being used in the wrong way. Now, men and women have different strengths and they can be used for good or they could be used for bad, right? And men have a tendency to be able to exert violence. It could be used for something good, to protect people. It could be used to keep the barbarians at bay, basically. Or it could be used and turned on the people you're supposed to be loving. And that's a bad manifestation of it. Just like someone who's incredibly generous, naturally, they're just very, very giving. oftentimes they can be the very people where that wonderful feature is used against them and they become kind of a doormat. They kind of get used a lot. And so you can kind of see in anything that you would consider maybe a gift, maybe you've got a gift for communication. Well, if you're using your communication skills and your gifting there in order to communicate lies and to deceive people, well, then that's a bad thing, right? So any of these things can be used well or used badly. But in this situation, this is how women exert aggression. Men exert aggression in a much more physical way. And so, and you know, before anybody comes to the chat, and I'm not actually watching the chat right now because this is a lot of pressure trying to take Nick's place here. This is kind of scary. I've been really nervous about this. But in these situations, anybody can look and say, I've had this happen to me, or I've even done it to somebody, you know? And so this whole idea of shaming, women will shame one another. They will shame men. They will shame society in order to correct them, get them in line. Women moralizing, basically, you know, a lot of times women will rationalize what they've done or try to explain why this thing's good or this thing's bad. And, you know, and you kind of go down the line, the ridicule, the rallying. Rallying is getting everybody on your side. So you've gossiped about this person. You've poisoned the well on that person. Now nobody actually has seen it with their own eyes, right? In the Bible, it talks about not bringing reproach on someone else. In the eyes of someone else. And it's interesting because even then it was well known that we will do this. We will talk about each other and we will destroy someone's reputation. And you're not supposed to do that. And you're supposed to let people see things for themselves and come to their own conclusion for the most part. But us women have a very hard time doing that, especially if we have encountered something that just feels really bad, or they've done something really bad to somebody else. You want others to know about it so that they will steer clear of that person, you know, so that they don't get hurt too. And so we rationalize or moralize why I'm doing this so that these people don't get hurt. Like, this person did a bad thing and they must be bad through and through then. You know, it may not be that they just had a bad day and treated you a little rough. You know, it might be that they're just a bad person and we're going to make sure everybody is rallied onto my side. And I have now got like 8 different people that know about this thing, and we've shamed that thing. And now we're going to ostracize that person and otherize them.
But I mean, it gets back to my point about how these approaches today, they're I mean, you know, because this comes across as very negative, right?
Yeah.
If you read this, you're like, man, women are they'll destroy you. They'll do everything other than just physically kill you, but they will destroy you. And that's true. That's what we're living through right now. But the point that I wanted to make was that when these are applied in a healthy way, because this is always going to happen. Like women are predisposed to this for the same reason that men are predisposed to violence. Does that mean that all men are going to be violent and they're going to turn into barbarians? No. Does this mean that all women are going to use gossiping, shaming, and rallying and ridiculing and stuff like that to just you know, destroy everybody? Of course not. But this does mean is that we bring different skills to the table. And it's like you said earlier, is that going to be used for a positive end or a negative end? In a healthy society, these things are actually used to keep things in check, to prevent people from deconstructing the foundations of that society, right? You rally to defend the tribe. You shame somebody who wants to, again, deconstruct the foundations of the tribe or of the civilization or of the nation, because women ultimately are historically, women were the ones that were staying at home and raising the children. And so they played a critical role in the preservation of that civilization. And these things are basically used to keep the home front secure while the men are going out there, you know, while the Romans are going out there conquering along the Rhine. The women are using these tactics in order to make sure that the city's not descending into chaos back at home. But what we have now is these things being applied to incredibly self-destructive ends. A good example that you brought up, and I hadn't actually thought of this, is that the rallying. So one example that you threw up, and we actually have this as a link, is the League of Women Voters.
Yes.
This is a very good example of rallying for arguably, not even arguably, rallying for very destructive ends. If
Right.
you're rallying to preserve the civilization, if you're rallying to preserve the tribe, that's a positive manifestation of it. But if you're using this in an identity politics perspective of building an us versus them mentality within the tribe, within the civilization, right? Of pitting women against men, which is what feminism is. It is pitting women against men. Now you've taken something that is a natural inclination for women and you've perverted it to a negative end. In this case, it's not to preserve the civilization. It's to divide the civilization and pit women against men. And, and you pointed out when we were reviewing this, some of the numbers here.
Right. Well, by the year, this is just going back to 2022, because that's how old this article is. Women are registered to vote at 84. So it was in millions.
In the millions.
In the millions.
Million.
84.4 million women are registered to vote, and only 77 million men are registered to vote.
So they're already outvoting men, and yet you still have an example of organizations that are trying to monopolize the female vote or treat them as a block.
But this entire chart is broken down basically in an us versus them sort of way. You've got men versus women. So women will identify the target of GSR, gossip, shaming, rallying. They will identify the target, the person that needs to be taken down, and they will do it. They will do this thing. In this situation, men in general are the target.
Which is, again, that's the negative. That is a negative example of these strategies being applied, because what these strategies are. What this, going back to our previous tab here, what this is supposed to be applied against. Remember when we did our podcast on the friend to enemy distinction?
Yep.
Those are supposed to be applied against enemies.
Right.
This is how men adjudicate the friend enemy distinction through violence,
right,
through warfare, or through hard politics.
This.
Women adjudicate the friend enemy distinction by destroying them socially, ostracizing them from the tribe, excluding them,
it's
calling
also
them
one
out.
of the reasons why in a lot of in some societies, women tend to be easier to radicalize than men. So this tactic, not only do women use this tactic, but it works well on them as well. And so this tactic it's basically built for women. So this tactic doesn't necessarily work as well on men, because men will just deal with it with their fist or whatever. Yeah, women,
but it's worth noting that men are not going to. I mean, there's exceptions.
They're affected by it, obviously, because men are from cradle to grave treated like defective girls. Men are not appreciated in this society whatsoever, and we've done plenty of podcasts about that and just kind of the state of things. And anyway, I won't go on a tangent there, but my point is, in some societies, like some of the societies that use terrorism and things like that, women are more radicalized even than some of the men. And that's one of the reasons why women will willingly go and sacrifice themselves, for this whole purpose. And so it's like, we all kind of look at certain countries, and we look at the rights that women have there, and we're just like appalled that these women, they can't even show their face or whatever. But if you talk to those women, they're all about it. They're all about it.
Yeah, there's a funny story of at the Battle of Yarmouk, which is kind of forgotten today, but it was one of the most important battles in world history. It's when the Caliphate conquered the Levant from the Byzantines at the very beginning of the Islamic conquests. Yarmouk was decided by like a knife's edge, and it lasted like 7 days. And on one of the nights, I can't remember the exact one, but in the middle of the battle, the Muslim army had been routed by Heraclius's forces. He wasn't commanding in person, but the Byzantines had pushed them back, and it looked like that the Romans were gonna win, that they were gonna save Syria from the Muslim conquests. And the retreating Muslim soldiers ran back to their camp, and their wives like beat them like with pots and pans and basically said, go back out there and fight again. Like, don't run away. And like they basically berated them and like shamed them into, no, you need to finish the job. And so they went back out there and they fought, and eventually they won. And that
Those are supportive women there.
Like, and that changed the entire course of human history. Had the Byzantines prevailed at Yarmouk, the Roman Empire might still be around today. The Islamic conquest would have been halted outside of the Arabian Peninsula. The entire course of human history would have been different.
Yeah.
And like that's a good example of. Sorry, I had to throw out a history example. It wouldn't be a.
I'm sure people have their bingo cards and they're like, all right, we got it.
But like the point is that there's a positive and negative manifestation of these things. And positive manifestation is you execute these very destructive strategies in order to preserve the tribe. The negative manifestation is when you apply a friend-enemy distinction and you just say men are the oppressors and we're going to gossip, shame, and rally against them. And we're going to treat women as the in-group and men as the out-group. And at that point, you've divided the tribe. And we should not be surprised when everything starts to implode when you take that mindset. These are very dangerous strategies that should be preserved against enemies, not against your fellow man.
Right. And then women also end up in the enemy category. Mm-hmm. If you're on the wrong side of their issues, and if you don't, so this is where we get to the face part, right? You basically believe the truth and you're not going to play their games. I'm not going to pretend that your penis is a female penis.
Well, you know what's happening is that the consequence of applying those female strategies against men as a block, right? Using gossiping and shaming and rallying, not against enemies of the civilization, but against men. What you have is you have this. Do you remember this story that we covered from near the beginning of the year about how there is a global gender divide that's emerging? This was a story from the Financial Times, and it showed some charts here that are just incredible. We've covered this before, but just to give a brief summary for our audience, there is a gender gap that's growing that previously had not existed. And you said at the beginning of this podcast, it's not just happening in the United States. It's happening in Canada. It's happening in Australia. It's happening in the United Kingdom.
South Korea is worse than
South Korea.
Yeah. And
so and this is younger voters. This isn't all voters. This is younger voters, 18 to 29.
Well, and South Korea, it's interesting to note also, has a population decline problem. And I mean, to the extent that they sell more adult diapers in Korea than they do baby diapers.
Well, because the birth rate's totally collapsed.
Right.
And this chart goes and shows that, like, look, we're not that far off, right? Women have flown into the stratosphere towards the left, and men have gotten actually a little bit more conservative. You have the same thing in Germany.
And it
you
says
have the same
liberal
thing in the United Kingdom.
It says liberal. And I'm just going to say, before anybody comes into the chat and is like, that's not the classical definition of liberalism. Yeah, that's been gone a long time. And I know what classical liberalism is, and economically, that is what I am. But we're not talking about classical liberalism. We're talking about the bastardized American definition, progressive, which isn't even progressive. It's just leftism. It's the word we use to describe these crazy freaks on the left.
It's blank slate egalitarianism is what it is.
So we're not talking classical liberalism. Let me just settle that right now.
And so, like, again, I'm not going to like read the entire, article again, but the point is that the consequence of applying these very destructive female strategies for engaging with enemies, and instead inappropriately applying them just against men in general, is that you now have a gender gap that's emerging for the first time ever.
Yeah.
Historically, one of the things that I told you when we were talking about doing this episode, when we found out that Nick wasn't going to be here and it was just going to be you and I, is we had a phone call where we were planning out this episode, and I brought up that, a lot of people don't remember this, in part because they weren't alive at the time, but before the 1970s, women were actually voting slightly, not overwhelmingly, but slightly more to the right of their male counterparts. Mm-hmm. The gap was still very small. We're talking like 5 points or less. But the fact is that women were actually slightly more conservative than men before the 1970s. A famous example that I've brought up before is before the Spanish Civil War in Spain. They had some very contentious elections, obviously, because it ended in a civil war. But in the 1930s, there was this one election after the Spanish Republic had been declared, the Second Republic, where the left had been just destroying the country, basically, that you had like literal Marxists in charge. And so there was a backlash where conservatives were voted into office. And in that election, conservatives won because women voted for the conservative parties. And then this set in stage a bunch of, things that ultimately led to a civil war, unfortunately. But the fact is that there was an attempted peaceful backlash against the left, and it was driven mostly by women in the 1930s in Spain. That's just one example, though. You can go to the U.S. until, I think it was 1976, that women were either as conservative or in some cases more conservative in their voting habits than men were.
Yeah, women overwhelmingly supported Ronald Reagan to push him over.
And I think that the reason why is in some ways for the same reason that today women are far more to the left of men. And again, this is just one example from the Financial Times, but we have a couple other. I'm going to jump just ahead real quick. These are some side-by-side polling. I polled one and Tina polled one. This is one from the Washington Examiner showing the breakdown by marital status. And it shows that, and we're going to go into more detail of the implications of that. But just to talk about men and women, it shows that, unmarried women are way to the left. They're almost 70% to the left. And out of these four categories, they're the only one that's voting majority Democrat.
Now, and this was taken from an exit poll. So these were like votes that actually happened.
Votes that were cast. Now, Tina found another poll that showed something similar, right? And the overall point, though, is that women are to the left of men politically, right? According to this poll, and this was taken just last year.
Well, I want to address something real quick because a lot of times
one second, right before you do, let me close the loop on this.
Go ahead.
So the problem is that we're looking at the voting habits now, and we're saying, well, women are objectively, we can just look at the exit poll and we can look at the partisan approval. Like, women are to the left of men. But I think the reason why women are to the left of men now is actually for the same reason that women historically were to the right of men. And it's because back when you had more traditional gender roles, back in the 30s or even as late as the 70s, women were actually working to preserve these institutions, preserve the traditional foundations of society. And so therefore they had a more conservative mindset because they were applying GSR type strategies against actual enemies, not against men. They were applying it against leftists that wanted to, again, the whole blank slate egalitarianism. They were applying this type of stuff against those people.
Yeah.
And so women in some ways had a more conservative mindset at the time because they were more interested in preserving that foundation.
Well, and
but as that foundation disappeared,
right,
they then swung towards the left.
Let me just bring up that foundation real quick. Historically, women were always more religious than men. And now men are more religious than women. And so the correlation is so tight that you can't deny that the deconstruction of religion and women letting go of that as a moral standard. Now they're trying to find a moral standard. They're trying to figure out where the truth is. And so it's very easy to radicalize women into sort of this religion of feminism where it's like, well, here are the moral truths and that's what we're fighting for. And now women are like, oh, well, whatever I do, I need to preserve that. And anybody who won't preserve that or disagrees with that or won't basically believe the lie, now those GSR tactics now are being used on you.
Yeah.
I know this as a woman who ran for office, how I was treated by other women and liberal men.
So to that point, there was a question. We had a super chat from Connor where he actually asked this question. So I have to ask it because it'll tee you up to answer this. He says, Tina, what are a couple experiences you've had with women in your neck of the woods who lean left? How do you respond to them in day-to-day, in the day-to-day?
Okay, so I've got two that come to mind. One of them was I was in a coffee shop. I had permission to be there because it was one of my campaign stops. And I was sitting at the table with several women who were probably in their 70s and 80s. Okay, and we were discussing some of the issues and what was going on at the state level because I was running for state office. And so I was going down the line explaining my position on a few of these really important issues to them. And this man from another table gets up and basically kind of throws his plate on the little counter and is like, thanks a lot for destroying my dinner, you blah, blah, blah. And he proceeded to, or destroying my lunch, he proceeded to call me like every nasty name he possibly could. You forked-tongued, slithering, like traitor to your gender, okay? Because obviously he could tell I was a conservative, I guess, based on our conversation. We weren't even being loud. And these women at a table nearby, there was a young man and a couple of women at the table nearby, and they were just flabbergasted at the way this man had treated me. They didn't know, because they couldn't hear my conversation, what we were talking about. And so the young man was like, I am so sorry you had to go through that. Why would that man, treat you that way? And the women kind of murmured amongst themselves. And then one turns and goes, are you a Republican? And I said, yes. And she goes, oh, okay. So she was willing to allow a man to verbally abuse another woman at a table with elderly women, like with expletives, okay? Like, I was called the C word more than you could imagine by leftist men. And leftist women were like, oh, it's okay. It's okay if you abuse her. That's totally fine. So that was one of the situations. And then another situation, I was working at the Republican headquarters in Culpeper, and Nick tells this story from his perspective because he came and rescued me from the situation and finished the conversation, thank God, because this woman was like going to use up all of my time, and there were other people coming in, and I just couldn't do it. But first, she comes in and she's like, I want this hate mail to stop coming to my door. She was holding something about Mitt Romney back in the day. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I ever supported Mitt Romney, but I guess he was our only choice. Ugh. Anyway, so she's like, I want this hate mail to stop coming to my house. And it was when he was recorded on a hot mic saying that, about 45% of the people, we're not really worried about what they say. We're trying to win the rest of them. And oh boy, did that really flip her out. And so anything with regard to Romney was hate mail. And she's like, and I'm just disgusted with you as a woman. How could you be a traitor to your gender? Traitor to your gender. How could you support this misogynistic organization and defend them? Like, you are the worst of the worst, like, how could you do this? And I'm trying to explain myself, and she was just blah, spewing her, shaming on me for being a conservative and for my stance on certain things. And we went through a few topics, and like, she was exhausting me. Nick comes in and she's like, puts her sights on him, and then he proceeds to completely destroy her, to the point where at the end she was like, well, I'd vote for you.
Yeah, I remember this story.
Yeah, that was crazy. But anyway, that conversation went really differently at the beginning when she just saw me. And so, yes, you get treated very differently as a conservative woman with the left. And so where were we? Okay, so we were talking about the voter demographic data breakdown. Can you bring up that other chart before you get to this one?
Was it this one or
the one I had up?
This
that
one? Yeah.
Okay, is there any way to like zoom in on that at
Yep.
all for the audience? Okay, so I just want to
explain what this is for our audio listeners too.
Okay, this is partisanship varying by gender and marital status, okay, and sexual orientation status. So it really breaks it down a little extra. And now this is not done from like an exit poll type. This was, what do you consider yourself?
And this was last year when this came out.
Right, last year. And so what you have is men, 52% lean right, 46% lean left. Women, 51% lean left and 44% lean right. So they're almost inversed, okay? But what's really interesting is you get to the married men, married women. And the reason I bring this up is because in the earlier chart, when it talked about single women and how they vote versus married women and how they vote, there's a very big disparity. Married women vote 50% Republican, okay, 50%, and only 45% liberal. That means there's some in the middle that just kind of do whatever. And then men, married men, vote 39% Democrat and 59% Republican. Now, they will typically try to say, oh, the only reason why Republican women who are married vote on the right is because their husbands force them to. These women have fallen under the influence
patriarchy
of patriarchy, and now they're voting more Republican because they're under the thumb of their husband. But I just bring this up because I want to dispute that just looking at the chart. Men in general, 52% Republican. Married men, 59%. There's a 7
Who knew that men were oppressing themselves into voting harder for Team Red?
A married man is 7 percentage points more likely to vote Republican than his unmarried counterpart. A woman who is married is 8% more likely to vote Republican than her unmarried counterpart. So if you look at that, there's pretty much a very similar increase for married people in general. And another thing is like people want to be like, oh, well, you know, maybe that guy's just so conservative and that's why she had to become conservative. Well, let's look at another stat real quick. And that is, let's look at divorced and separated men versus divorced and separated women. So women in general, 51 to 44, right? 51 Democrat, 44% Republican. Divorced women are 51% and 44%. So literally the identical numbers, women who are divorced, identical to their general population counterparts. And then married men, divorced men are at 53% Democrat, 44% Republican. They lean exactly the same amount Republican as their female counterparts within the same subset, okay? So basically, divorced men vote very much the same way as women in general, which tells you, after the marriage dissolves, did the man like stop oppressing himself to be Republican? Now, there's more in these numbers that are kind of interesting, but that I just wanted to bring that part up. Even never married men vote much more to the left than right.
Yeah, there's some variance there because the Washington Examiner poll showed something different, which was that unmarried men are actually mildly leaning, and this was an exit poll. But that's
from an exit poll.
It is.
So that's where the rubber meets the road, you know?
You're gonna get swings like that, and it's also a relatively small sample size. You know, according to them, it's only 16% of the population. So, like, you're gonna get swings here depending on the poll and depending on who you're polling. That gets into a whole conversation about.
I just want to bring up, let's make of this what you will. Can you pull up the other poll just one more time? Men who are divorced tend to be more liberal than men who are not divorced, or they're even more liberal than their regular across the board counterparts that aren't in that subset.
Yeah.
Which goes back to what I've been saying forever. The reason feminist women hate men so much is because they're always around feminine, liberal men, or leftist men. I won't say liberal. Leftist men. And leftist men, I've gotten the most abuse from leftist men. So it kind of makes sense that leftist men are being left by their liberal counterpart women. Anyway, so.
Well, have you seen those, like, I think they're TikToks and Instagram reels of left-wing young women that will say things like, I can't find a masculine liberal man.
Yeah.
And so, like, they'll be like there is.
I wish I would have brought
there's
the
this
chart.
Trend that I've caught of liberal leaning. Now, they might not be like radically left wing, right? I'm not talking about the blue haired, you know, like lunatics. I'm talking about, you know, just normie Democrats, right? But there's this trend that I've caught of women, younger women that are on the left politically. Again, they might not be like straight up Marxists, right? But they're on the left politically, and they want a masculine partner, but they can't find any that are on the left politically. And so then they find one that is on the right. A good example of this is actually the YouTuber Shoe on Head, who was, for a very long time, she was kind of on the left, kind of quirky with her being on the left, but she got married, I think it was like a year ago, and like she's a conservative now because she's also a mother. And it was just really funny, like seeing her,
how that happens.
Seeing her older YouTube content. Like, she was on the left for a very long time. Like, she supported Bernie when he ran, I believe, in 2016, and she married a conservative Catholic, pretty masculine guy who's absolutely on the right. Her spouse, I actually follow him on Twitter. He's kind of an interesting guy. He's more of a post-liberal now at this point, but he's definitely on the right. Like, he's a big fan of like JD Vance and stuff like that. And it's just funny how, like, when they met each other and then when they got married and then when they had a kid, like, her politics just changed very, very quickly in a very short amount of time. And it wasn't because he's oppressing her or anything like that. It's because it goes back to this quote that I've said on more than one time on this podcast from Oswald Spengler, that in all times and in all places, the men and women of every society deserve each other. And what he meant by that is it was a bit of a pessimistic take, because he wrote this book called Decline of the West, where he was predicting, this was 100 years ago, he was predicting basically that civilization was going to implode in on itself. And I think he was totally right in that respect.
Definitely doing that right now.
And he's getting at that part of the reason why is because of that complementary nature of men and women deserving each other, as in they serve an important function when it comes to building civilization together in different ways. Men go out there and they do the physical work of building civilization. They're the ones working on the oil rigs, right? They're the ones that are out there fighting in battle, right? They're putting their lives on the line to protect the civilization. They're the ones that are paving the roads. They're the ones that maintain the infrastructure. But women are the ones that raise the children. And women in an ideal, healthy society are also the ones that civilize the men. Men civilize the world, but women civilize men. And I will continue to say that, despite the fact that it's very unpopular to say that nowadays. And the reason why is because historically it is true. That is a positive manifestation of men and women working together, using their unique complementary roles to build something beautiful. The problem that we have right now is, going back to the old Spengler quote, what we have right now is feminized men and masculine women. And they're both miserable. And this gets actually into another point here, which is the mental illness epidemic that we have going on right now. Look at the numbers here. This is insane.
So for the audio listeners, can you verbally break that down?
Yeah. So this is an interesting Twitter account. This guy, Zach Goldberg, who does a lot of academic research. He's getting his PhD into, like, basically what he's trying to do is he's trying to understand what caused the Great Awakening. What happened beginning in really like 2012 to 2014 that caused society to just lose its mind. And one of the things that he has found in his studies is looking at reported mental illness rates. And then he broke it down by, sex. He broke it down by things like marital status. He broke it down by ideology. And when he broke it down by ideology and sex, and then also by race, because there's far more whites than there are blacks, Hispanics, and Asians in the United States. And so he was looking at particularly white men and white women, and then he was looking at it from an ideological perspective. So this chart shows white liberals broken down by men and women, and white conservatives broken down by men and women. And it's mental illness rates over a period of time going as far back as 2002 all the way up until 2022. So this is relatively recent data. And what it shows is that, quite frankly, white liberal women have just lost their mind. Like, they've gone insane. The mental illness rate
literally gone insane. And there, it's crazy because we talk about the left kind of, it's like a mind virus.
It truly is a mind virus. And these are different reporting metrics. So one of them is from Pew Research, one of them is from GSS, one of them is from KFF. These are all like polling outlets, right? One of them is from YouGov. But the point is that the trajectory of all of these things, going back the last 20, 25 years, shows that white liberal women, it's at this point, as of 2 years ago, who knows what it's at now, as of 2 years ago, it's almost 60% of them have some sort of, according to this metric here, some sort of, quote, serious mental health condition such as depression or anxiety. This is according to data from 2 years ago. And what's also crazy is that when you look at men, it's almost 50% of them. Now, the danger here, and this is according to his tweet, and let me be sure to tilt the mics, that way our producer, Nate over here, doesn't get upset.
Yeah.
But what he noticed is that here's the tweet. He said, "Not sure how much I trust the last KFF 2022 data point in this series. For it suggests not only a majority of all white liberals have a mental health condition, but also that white conservative women have abruptly and dramatically jumped on the bandwagon." And then he said that he'll come back once he has more data on this point. This was from last year. He has dug into this data a little bit more. So he's an account that I follow from time to time just to pull these type of stats for the podcast. But one of the things that caught my eye is that apparently now it's also hitting female conservatives as well. Now, I don't know if this is entirely true.
Only according to one of them.
According to one
because
data
all the
point,
rest,
yes.
all the rest have us pretty like in line with the dudes.
So if we leave out the 2022 data from KFF, then what we see is that the trend line shows that, you know, the Great Awakening has had an impact on conservative men and women, but minuscule.
We would be at like the 20-25% mark, whereas liberal women are right around the 50% mark.
And liberal men are not that far behind them, right? And here's the thing too: this is not existing in a vacuum. Here's another data point, also pulled by him.
I feel like this one's a little easier to see.
It's a little bit more dated. This is from 4 years ago, but again, we know from other polling that this has not gotten better.
It's gotten worse. Way worse.
Keep in mind, this was taken right before COVID. This was taken in March 2020, right before the lockdowns. This was also taken right before the Summer of Love, the George Floyd riots.
If we confuse causation and correlation, then we would be like, oh, the jab did it.
But like, it's notable that the responding, you know, here is before the pandemic, which we know did a number on people's mental health. This is before the mass psychosis that was the Summer of Love and the George Floyd riots and the BLM stuff of the summer of 2020, right? Like where it was like the Great Awakening reached its crescendo. And even here, this one is actually broken down by age and ideology and gender. And what this shows is that 18 to 29-year-olds that are white female liberals, it's almost 60% of them have a mental health condition.
Yeah.
I mean, just the numbers here are insane. I have shared this particular graph over and over again on social media. And the question that I'm always asking is, at what point do we stop giving legitimacy, equal say, to the mentally ill in society that don't know what they're doing and are voting to just deconstruct every single social institution that actually allows for civilization to function? These people should not, I'm sorry, it sounds harsh, but at some point somebody has to have a conversation about this. People like this, 18 to 29-year-old liberal women that have an almost 60% mental health crisis, self-reported, by the way. This is self-reported. Sorry, I'm like breaking the mic at this point. I'm getting passionate here. At some point, we've got to be asking the question of, why are we letting these people have political power?
Well, the left would argue with you and say that, well, actually, it's the same across the board. It's just that right-wingers are too afraid to tell the truth about their mental illness. Yeah, it's the same across the board.
60% of everybody has a mental health, has a mental health issue of some sort. No, it doesn't.
No.
This is historically
what's really crazy?
Abnormal.
Can you go back to the other graph real quick? Because we were sort of talking about this before the podcast, and I kind of want to touch on it because I found it interesting. So what you see is at that point, what is that, about 2020-ish? 2019-ish? Like, the numbers are pretty level for conservative males, and they have even spiked up. Now, it's only spiked up like 4%, or 5% maybe. But even they are going up. And Christian was saying, wow, like it's even affecting them. And I said, well, hold on. If anybody has more of a cause to have some kind of mental illness, it would be conservative men. And the reason I say that is because liberal men and liberal women are not the ones, working on oil rigs, watching things get blown up, or watching guys fall off of that thing, doing these like super dangerous jobs. They're not the ones who have watched their buddies on their team get blown up from an IED. I mean, there's a lot of things like PTSD associated issues that conservative men, they're the ones that fight our wars. They're the ones that fight our battles. And PTSD and things like that should be showing up right around that time. So they're the only ones who they've actually seen some stuff that probably plague them at night, that probably cause them to be hyper aware and hyper vigilant.
The way that I would describe it is, to go back to the other chart here, the most coddled group in this entire country is the one that has the highest mental illness rate.
Yes.
The most coddled group in the entire country.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you're not allowed to criticize women. You're certainly not allowed to criticize young women. And there's a biological reason why. It goes back to it's basically the Bateman principle, but applied to politics.
And you're not allowed to correct women in any way.
And I'm sorry, but out of every single group here, the one that gets the most amount of sympathy, certainly within academia, certainly within the media, are younger 18 to 29-year-old younger liberal women. I cannot think of a demographic in this country that gets more coddling, more affirmation, more protection within our institutions than that group. And this group has the highest mental illness rate of any demographic in the entire country. It's almost 60% of them. And again, the question that I'm going to keep asking is, at what point do we simply say, your opinion on this matter does not matter as much as all of these other groups here, particularly the moderates and conservatives, because you don't know what you're talking about. You don't have the life experience. You're mentally ill. You have delusional worldviews. What sort of suffering has a 22-year-old Kamala Harris voter who's in her 5th year of university? What sort of life experience or suffering do you have to say that you know how all of society should be organized? 5,000 years of human civilization doesn't matter, but the 22-year-old barista that's studying queer theory at Berkeley knows how to build civilization. Give me a break. You don't even know how to keep your life in order.
Yeah, and so much of this you can kind of point back to policies of the left and academia. You know, I don't know, are we getting to academia yet?
Yes, we're about to get to academia. So here's an article that was written by Richard Hanania, who I do not like as a person. I find him to be an incredibly cringe and obnoxious Twitter commenter who loves engagement bait. But that doesn't take away from the fact that occasionally he can write something that is pretty profound and pretty provocative. And he wrote this article. This was actually 2 years ago, but it's still relevant today. He wrote this article titled "Women's Tears Win in the Marketplace of Ideas." And he goes on to say how belief in the blank slate puts plus residual gender double standards creates cancel culture and the difficulties of fighting back. This is a long article. I'm not going to read through the entire article, although I highly recommend that our audience takes a look at it if they ever get a chance. That's why I'm reading the title here. And he brings up a couple of points. So I'll read the beginning of it, and then I'll jump to some points that I think are relevant. So he says, having mentioned the concept a few times, many have been encouraging me to write a Substack on the feminization of political life and its connection to free speech issues. And he talks about how a couple other people beat him to it, but he's already written about the overrepresentation of women in HR. And he goes on to say that, we can understand the decline of free speech as a kind of female pincer attack. Women demand more suppression of offensive ideas at the bottom of institutions and form a disproportionate share of managers who hear their complaints at the top. So, he goes on and he says that, a lot of times we talk about issues involving young people or college students or liberals, but in reality, they're gendered issues. And it actually gets back to this article here from the Financial Times talking about this growing gender divide that previously had not existed in not just the United States, but really most countries around the world, most developed countries at least. And Hanania goes on to say that he thinks that this is an interesting dynamic at play. He says, I think there's a certain weirdness to the arguments made by both sides of the gender issue. To simplify, you have the left, which leans towards the blank slate and opposes gender stereotypes, but demands women in public life be treated as too delicate for criticism, and conservatives who believe in sex differences but say to treat people as individuals. Notice how it seems like that there's actually a bit of a contradiction on both sides, for entirely different reasons. This actually gets back to my criticism of conservatives. I don't think conservatism is radical enough. I think that I don't identify as a conservative. I identify as being on the right, but not a conservative. And when I say that, people must think, wow, Christian, you must be pretty moderate. No. I don't think conservatives are right-wing enough.
Yeah.
I think conservatives are preserving whatever the left was doing a generation ago. I am firmly to the right of anybody that identifies as a conservative.
That's a completely fair criticism, because conservatives now are we want to be better conductors of the train wreck, basically.
And it gets into this, like the way that he articulates this, I think he does it perfectly, where he says that, the left adopts a blank slate egalitarian approach, but then they will shut you down if you criticize women in any way. Women are sacrosanct, especially within academia. But then conservatives will say, well, I believe in sex differences. If you don't say that, you're not a conservative, right? If you think that men can become women, I'm sorry, you're not a conservative. Conservatives will say, I believe in sex differences, but then they will also say, well, I just want to treat everybody as an individual. Which one is it? I think that part of the reason that we're having an over-feminization of the economy, and dare I say it, an over-feminization of every element within society, is because conservatives are fighting a losing battle, because they will say things like, I want to treat people as individuals. Now, there's a point to this that I agree with. If you say I want to treat people as individuals because I think that they have moral worth,
yeah,
I agree with that. But if you say I want to treat people as individuals and you say I want to treat people as individuals, it gets back to your point earlier that ultimately you think, and I agree with you, that I don't think that most women, and obviously you can speak to this better than I can, I don't think that most women want to be treated as an individual. I think that most women want to be treated as women. And when I mean that in like a chivalrous sense.
Well, I think that women, conservative and liberal, both, we have kind of been through the ringer just like you guys have. I think that, men and any kind of masculine attribute has been so attacked for so long. I mean, even when I was a kid, it was under attack. And what that did is not only did it harm the boys and harm the men and cause these weak, effeminate men, it also told women that we should not expect this either. In fact, we should be offended if these men treat us in this nicer way than they treat each other. Like, men will be rough on each other. They will, they'll insult each other and then laugh it off. I mean, men, the way that they joke, especially military men, man, they will joke in the harshest way possible, but they will also protect you with their life, you know, and that. And because you know that, it gives you a little bit of leadway as far as how you can joke and how you can criticize. I mean, guys will dress each other up one side and down the other and tell them they need to get their crap together and then walk away and go have a drink together and hang out and be on good terms and have respect for each other. They could fight and have respect for each other. But women do not operate like that. And we already talked about the way that we operate. And so when women get treated just like the men, we think that this tactic's being used on us. It's like we think that we're being treated worse than you would treat a guy. Because how often do you hear women say, like, I just want to be treated like one of the guys? No, you don't. No, you do not. I mean, we want to think that's how we want to be treated, but that's going to be a complaint to HR if you are treated like one of the dudes.
Every man, and I'm speaking as a man on this, every man that I know would never subconsciously actually unless they want to like lose their job, they would not treat women the way that they treat men. I've worked in politics my entire life, and so my work habits are different than other people because campaigns.
I've got a
and
story
stuff like
about that. There were some people that thought that Christian was a sexist at the General Assembly because of the way he would treat the female staffers.
I've been through,
and so he was nicer to the female staffers than he was to the male ones. He was still treating them much better, but they thought they were being treated so badly, by Christian, because he doesn't flourish everything with all the niceties. He just says, I need this and I need that, or here's
I
this,
can be
here's
abrasive
that.
at times.
And there are times, just, a wee bit. But somebody talked to Nick and is like, Christian, I think he's sexist. And Nick's like, no. You should see how he treats me, and I'm his boss, at the time, back when you worked for him. And it was definitely something where, no, Christian's just no nonsense, and he just gets things done, and he doesn't have time for this flowery crap. And in fact, he was doing some of the flowery crap for this lady, and she just still didn't like it. We want to feel like we're not being treated differently, but we do want to be treated differently.
So it's because of going back to the beginning of our conversation, like the way that men and women approach the world and how they handle with stressful situations, how they handle with debate, in some ways, how they approach the friend-enemy distinction as well. It's because of those different approaches that you get, unfortunately, some contradictory and chaotic instances when they interact with each other in a sphere like the academy, like within universities and colleges. This example that Hanania goes with when he talks about the rules of male versus female debate. So again, when men will debate each other, it doesn't matter if it's in a university campus or if it's on a battlefield, right? They will engage with each other differently than if they were engaging with a woman. And likewise, though, women will engage with each other one way, but I've noticed that they don't necessarily always change their approach to things when they're engaging with a man. And so what this creates is a bit of conflict. And Hanania goes on and he says that Heather Hying has recently written on the differences between male and female competition and the difficulties that result when both sexes are put in the same environment and told to play by the same rules. It's a valuable read, but her discussion is at a mostly abstract level. It's worth thinking about the specifics of what debate between the two sexes looks like in the real world. For all the talk of equality, our culture treats violence, inclusivity, and aggression towards women much more seriously than towards men. This creates a difficult dynamic in which if a man disagrees strongly with a woman, he has to tread very carefully if he is not to be judged harshly by observers. And he goes on to say, I recently watched a full Yale Halloween costume video for the first time. For those who weren't paying attention or too young to remember, here's a summary of what happened. If you've seen in the video, it's worth checking out. Basically, long story short, there was this, huge uproar over, appropriation and stuff like that. It's just another one of these woke crusades, right? You're not allowed to dress like certain ways for Halloween. And there was this huge uproar at Yale. Of course, it was at Yale, right? This is the same campus that had the Gaza protest this year. And this was a couple years ago, but he's using this as an example, right? Of people disagreeing on this new woke crusade that was taking place at Yale over Halloween costumes. And he's going on to explain in this article that, the way that men and women are debating each other over this topic is just very different than when it's just men debating each other. And long story short, he goes on to say that, of course, most women do not cry over hurt feelings or scream in men's faces when they're angry. Rather, it's the loudest minority, being able to indulge their passions in ways that men cannot, that drive most of the censorship we see. How many women were behind the Yale Halloween costume controversy that became the center of American intellectual life? Like 10? Imagine at least one woman crying in every boardroom, newsroom, faculty meeting, and government office, and you can realize the decentralized force that has led us to this point. So what he's trying to say is it's not like women as a whole, women with a capital W, are driving the Great Awakening. What it is a minority of women that are on the left, firmly on the left, that
they've been radicalized. These are people who have been radicalized.
That are applying that friend-enemy distinction of the gossiping, shaming, and rallying in a perverse manifestation of it towards the wrong group of people, towards men. And they're doing so, and then they're leveraging their status as, in some ways, a protected class. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean this by force of law. I mean this by biology, because women are a protected class. It doesn't matter. I don't care what the law says. I don't care what what legal code says. I don't care what your HR department says. It is ingrained within us as human beings for men to be more protective towards women than towards men. And the reason why is because of the Bateman principle. It's because eggs are more expensive than sperm. It requires more effort for women to bring a child into the world than a man to bring a child into the world. And that manifests itself in different ways. And so what this does, it goes back to that famous quote that the reason that there is no female Einstein is the same reason there is no female Jack the Ripper, because nature takes more chances on men than women, because ultimately men are more expendable than women. That's a really unfortunate thing to
women
conclude.
Are a population limiter.
That's what the Bateman principle is. Women are a limiting resource. A limiting resource. I remember I brought this up on the podcast once, and Nick's like, man, you're going to pick up a lot of girls saying that. Just hear me out. A limiting resource is something that prevents a population from just exponentially exploding, right? So a good example could be food supply. That's a limiting resource. Land mass. How, do you have the ability to house everybody, right? That's a limiting resource. Women themselves are a limiting resource. this is the unique thing that the Bateman principle argued that was so different than previous limiting resources, which are usually external factors like the climate or the environment or, again, food supply or something like that. The Bateman principle argues that women themselves, because of biology, are a limiting resource to a population because they can only have a certain number of children for a certain number of years, and it takes 9 months, and it requires a ton of energy and time, and during that period, their ability to do things is much more limited, and so therefore, women themselves are a limiting resource, and so therefore, there has to be a significant amount of deference given to...
You protect things that are valuable.
You protect things that are valuable. You protect the food supply. You protect the housing supply. Well, you protect the women. Because the women are themselves a limiting resource to your civilization's ability to expand and grow.
And there we have one of the problems is that women are now treated as though they are not a limited resource. In fact, if you've got a penis and you can put on some lipstick and wear, some high heels, then you can even be a woman. It doesn't matter what biology says, right? And then you also have women who have been... Basically, the left has used so many lies, and they use the GSR tactic. So the correlation I was wanting to draw is that the gossiping, shaming, and rallying is exactly the tactic that the left uses to draw people and to ostracize people. And because it's a female tactic, whether it's good or bad, because it's a female tactic, females are more susceptible to it. And that's where you get these women who have become completely radicalized into believing things that are not true because there is no longer a moral anchor to hold this tactic basically accountable, or to use the tactic towards something good. And so you have all these couple generations now of women who, they will, at the minute you say they are a limited resource and that women can have babies and that's valuable and important, they will immediately reject that and be like, I don't want that to be all I'm about. That's not all I am. And it becomes this thing where women now are rejecting what it is that they themselves are uniquely capable of doing. And in fact, it is now being sold to them that the real value is in your ability to destroy that ability, the ability to destroy what you are able to bring about that no one else is able to bring about. You are able to reproduce and have you basically hold the future of society in your womb. Like the minute when you're born, you already have all the eggs you'll ever have. You're already carrying the future. And instead of teaching women that this is something to be valued, this is something to be proud of, and this is something to aspire to, we are now beating it out of women and teaching women that let's just be inferior men. We should just, the best thing you can hope for is to be an inferior male. And this goes hand in hand with all this climate garbage. I'm not saying that climate change doesn't exist, but I don't believe people have as much to do with it as people want to say. And I think that the science is bullcrap and they've been cooking the books. So make that whatever. But all this climate stuff also goes hand in hand with population control. And they really, like the left is really in love with this idea of lowering the population and overcrowding. And part of it's because the left, because they're so into the hive mind and so into groupthink, they gravitate toward high population areas. So in their experience, then that just means that, oh, look how overcrowded this place is. And they live in their own little bubble. They don't even think about how much space there is everywhere else. They want to limit the population. So you should not be having kids into this world. And we want to do our part. We are the worst thing to happen to the world. So humans need to reduce population. So the left is very much a cult of death. And they've been telling women that you're basically doing society a benefit by aborting your child. And in fact, that should be your number one issue. Your ability to bring forth the future is whatever. Like, who cares about that? And God forbid we say that women have anything nurturing to do. No. You should just go be an inferior man and just rip out whatever, happens to grow in your womb as you go and do whatever the hell you want to do with whoever you want to do it with. And so the left is, I believe, one of the reasons women are so liberal on the left, and that correlates with their mental illness, is because we are trying to take biology and unwire it. And we're basically deconstructing what women were purposed to do, like this magical, amazing thing that women can do. And we're telling them that's like, who wants to be a slave to that? And we're telling women that it's just so much better that you go work 9 to 5 in a cubicle. That is so much better for you. And it's so much better for everybody else. And in fact, you're saving the environment. And so these women are taught now to not only reject what only their bodies can do, not only to reject it and to try to stop it from happening to begin with. Of course, they don't tell them to stop, not to have the sex, but do whatever you can to stop that from happening, or delay it as long as possible, which increases the chances of other problems, right? But like, go ahead and dismember your own young. Take your own legacy, your own future, and just dismember it limb from limb, rip it out, throw it in the trash, and go back to your freaking cubicle.
Well, it goes back to what I said earlier, that we are encouraging women to become like men and men to become like women, and it's not going to work out. It's what it's ultimately going to do is leave people unhappy in the long run. That's the best case scenario, is it's going to leave people unhappy. The worst case scenario is civilization is going to just implode.
Well, young men are, like, we already talked about how young men are really in crisis, but that chart shows that young women are too.
It's just a different manifestation.
It's a different type of crisis. Yeah. But it just goes to show you, like, what's happening isn't working. And it's one of the reasons why I have so much beef with the education system, because you've got this this system which almost operates like an organism. Like, think of it like a hive, right? You're creating the next generation of the workforce, and a huge portion of that workforce that you're creating is going to go back into education, right? So the left has already captured these institutions, like, heavily. If you just look at the donations, and you can tell that the education system and the people in it are overwhelmingly on the left, and the people who are in it that are on the right are doing like the Lord's work, man. They are in there trying their hardest to
They're outnumbered.
They're so outnumbered.
50 to 1.
But I don't want to ignore the people that do it. And it's a ministry, like, I don't want to tell you not to go teach there, because we're all sent into some kind of battle, and that's yours. But the point is that overwhelmingly we have leftists who are pouring into the children, and everything goes through their leftist lens. So it's not like they're teaching you from curriculum that says this is critical race theory, but everything they're learning and everything they're pouring in is coming out through that lens. And so these children are being raised up to become leftists, and then they go into higher education, and women go into higher education more now than men do. And
they also go into HR departments. They go into the bureaucracy.
They go into garbage degrees. I mean, it's not like, oh yeah, like, she's a civil engineer, blah, blah, blah. It's like, not really. Not really. I mean, some, but not most. Most of them, it's like stupid gender studies bull crap. And now they're a barista at Starbucks. Congratulations with your 80 grand in school debt.
Well, those aren't the dangerous ones. The dangerous ones are the ones that go into actual powerful positions that are dealing with things, related to other people. That's why I said HR.
And the system is creating these activists in order to plug them into other institutions within society. But here's where, HR, that's bad, okay? But a lot of times out there in the free market, it can be dealt with it can be dealt with, which is why you see a lot of these companies like starting to abandon DEI, and like, they can correct still. The education system's a little different. So you've got people going into the education system learning all this leftist stuff, and then those people go back and go through higher ed, and then it's almost like it's a concentrated effect because they've been through all of this, never went into the real world in order, because people entering the real world tend to move to the right a little bit. Well, they never get a chance to move to the right. They go back into education. And now those children are getting more and more and more concentrated leftism because these people have never spent time outside of the education system in order to learn anything about the real world. And so that's one of the reasons you're seeing education get so bad and higher education get so bad, just across the board, not just women. But I do think that the fact that women are going in there more often, and they're going into fields or courses of study that are much more concentrated in kind of absorbing all of this ideology. I mean, and then they're going out into the world. And so I do think that is one of the reasons women are more on the left. And if you look at like the education charts and things like that, and people that are college educated are more likely now to be liberals or leftists and vote on the left. Now, if you talk to a leftist, they're going to say that the reason for that is that they have been taught how to properly think, and they're much more intelligent now than everybody else. But if that were the case, then it would hold true throughout history, but that's not the case. Education has gotten much more liberal, and it used to be that if you were college educated, you voted more on the right. Now, if you're college educated, you vote more on the left. Why would that be if you're just being taught how to think better? Instead, you look at the way that this works, the education system works almost like an organism that's kind of breeding itself. And like you look at animals and you breed for certain traits, and you bring this one together with this trait, that trait, and you breed them to be even more concentrated in that trait.
What we have right now is a system that is geared towards producing cultural Marxists. And
yes.
The problem is that, and I've said this a few times, and I need to figure out how to properly articulate this a little bit more, but we live in an age of disillusion. And what I mean by that is that the traditional social bonds that allow for civilization to flourish, that allow for men and women to flourish, they're all dissolving, every single one of them. Like we talk about, the mental health epidemic that we have right now. We talk about the loneliness epidemic that's going on right now. People are less connected to, people are getting married less often than ever before. People are having kids less often than ever before. We are not atomized individuals. We are social creatures. Humans are meant to interact with one another in healthy social settings. Every single one of these things is being deconstructed right now. This is why I say that we are in an age of disillusion. The typical traditional social and political and cultural bonds that hold a group of people together, they're all disappearing right now, or they're all being perverted or inverted from their original purpose. It goes back into the whole, we are teaching men to become, like, we're treating men like defective women, as you said earlier. I said that, we're teaching men to become women, in some cases literally. And then to women, we're saying you shouldn't be feminine, you should be masculine.
Right.
And then we wonder why people are upset. There was somebody in the comments that was like, in fact, let me find it. You had somebody in the comments that said, keep telling modern people they have to have traditional relationships and watch the loneliness epidemic continue. It's a lie. No, the lie is telling people that you don't need these traditional relationships and you can be happy. The data is very clear on that point. When you atomize individuals and you treat them as mere cogs in a machine rather than as something that is greater than just themselves, and that there is a healthy way that this can play out in your relationship to your spouse or to your children or to your community or to your nation. When you dissolve those bonds that give people purpose and drive and meaning in their day-to-day lives, I don't mean ultimate purpose, I mean your 9 to 5, so to speak. When you dissolve those things, you shouldn't be surprised when everybody's depressed. And I'm saying, to this part, I'm not saying from personal experience, but when everybody's depressed just sitting in their pod all day long, I do not leave my house except when I go hiking in northern Scotland. But like, You shouldn't be surprised when there's an epidemic of mental illness. Nobody's leaving their house. Nobody's getting married. Nobody's having any children. Nobody's interacting with one another. The traditional social bonds that for thousands of years gave people meaning and purpose despite all the misery around them, despite all the suffering around them. They didn't have the internet 1,000 years ago, and yet people were actually happier than they are today. You should be asking yourself why. Now, the left will deny this and say, no, everybody was miserable. Everybody was just offing themselves.
They engage in cope.
Then why did the birth rate not collapse 1,000 years ago? Why are we not extinct as a civilization today? Because we're heading towards extinction at this point. You should be asking yourself, if everybody had a mental illness, if everybody was miserable, if everybody was just oppressed by male patriarchy 1,000 years ago, why did people get up in the morning and have kids? Why did they go out there and build civilization? How did we get to this point? If people were so miserable and so mentally ill 1,000 years ago and just hated their life, how did we even get to this point? We should be extinct by now. The very existence of civilization today is proof that 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, people were not all mentally ill. People were not all depressed. People were not all isolated individuals that were miserable with their lives. And this is despite the fact that the material conditions of 1,000 years ago, of 2,000 years ago, are infinitely worse than they are today. We didn't have modern medicine. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have electricity. We didn't have any of the conveniences of modern life. And yet people did live, no matter what the leftists like to say, people did live more fulfilling lives. People lived happier lives. People were more content with themselves in the past than they were today. Does this mean we need to deconstruct? Am I saying we need to go full Ted Kaczynski? Of course not. First off, I'm not saying go mail bombs to universities, right? But I mean, even in his broader framework of criticizing, modernity and industrialization, I'm not saying you need to deconstruct the internet or deconstruct electricity and go back to living, primitive caveman-like lives in order to have a fulfilling life. What I'm saying is that we've deconstructed the social bonds and we've simply said, we'll just replace that with technology. That's not working out. You cannot substitute a meaningful life with the internet. You cannot substitute meaningful connections with people with YouTube. And I say this as we're streaming on YouTube right now. I'm not saying YouTube is bad. I'm not saying the internet is bad. I'm not saying technology is bad. I'm saying these are great conveniences. They are not suitable replacements to the foundational thing that actually gets people out of bed in the morning and go out there and conquer civilization and build something. Plant, so to speak, plant the trees whose shade you will not be able to live under, but your children and grandchildren will. The only way that you get that is if you restore those traditional connections. There was somebody in the super chat that asked a question, actually.
Well, can I piggyback on that real quick? I think that a lot of times we always have people say things like this in the chat, whether we're talking about marriage, whether we're talking about kids, we're talking about education and the future, anything like that. We always have people that are like, oh, you're talking about this kind of thing, and that's not really what's happening anymore, and it's really lucky for you that you were able to do this, but that's not what anybody's able to do now. And I want to push back on that. There are still people doing it traditionally. There are still people who care about these things and are reaping the benefits of it. And I think that saying that doesn't exist anymore is basically just cope. It's like, it hasn't existed for me, therefore it doesn't exist out there for anybody.
Or it's difficult. It's difficult to recultivate it.
And it's hard to know. Here's the thing. You can either stop and there's two ways to deal with having been lied to. You can either recognize that you've been lied to and then adjust and change course and do something that maybe is a little crazy that you've been told isn't gonna work, but like, look how it's worked out for them so far. So let's go ahead and adjust and change course a little bit. You've got those people that will adjust, change course, and then they can reap the benefits of that. And then you have the people that are like, it's just so far gone. You guys trying to preserve any type of tradition or anything like that, it's ridiculous at this point. Nobody can do that. So we may as well just hit the accelerator and just go full board into it. It's basically the difference between still believing you have agency and can control your life a little bit and just giving up.
We had a super chat that I want to ask you. Steven said, Tina and Christian, do you think wokeism can go away without a large-scale return to Christianity? I am Coptic, and church is the only normal place left. I want your take before I reply.
I don't think so.
You don't think so? You don't think that wokeism can go away without a large scale? Yeah. I
You
agree.
have to have some kind of a revival. And this is a whole different episode, but I want to do a podcast episode with Nick about deconstructionism and talk about how there's this trend within, especially the Protestant wing of the Christian church now, who is deconstructing what they have believed. And anybody who starts down the road of deconstruction always ends up walking away from their faith. Within 10 years, they walk away from their faith. And that's a trend now. And not only do we need to have an end to this deconstruction thing, which is super just catastrophic within the church, but it has waves outside the church. And so much of this has come from people who start down this road of, well, I don't really believe this thing that the Bible says. I actually believe this. Well, the minute you start parsing out and deciding, I don't believe this, but I do believe that, then you're just kind of piecemealing a religion together based on nothing more than what you prefer. And once you start doing that, you're always going to naturally prefer not to serve God.
Well, the problem is that you've created a belief system that you yourself know is just man-made.
It puts you on a road toward leaving the faith.
Now, I don't want to dig too deep into this, but I will answer the super chat. I think a lot of people have noticed this. I have this tweet that I just pulled up from Elon from a few days ago where he said, he was trying to rhyme here. He said, atheism left an empty space. Secular religion took its place, but left the people in despair. Childless hedonism sans care. Maybe religion's not so bad to keep you from being sad. I love how he said childless hedonism sans care. We have all of the drawbacks of a fully liberated society with none of the advantages of a fully liberated society. Liberalism has promised to free us from all the shackles and bonds that, society and civilization places upon us. And now we're looking around and we are rootless. We have no connection to, like I said, we're atomized individuals.
Yeah, it has caused us to dive headlong into mental illness because the world no longer makes sense.
And Elon, who for a long time was an atheist, or at least an agnostic or a skeptic, is starting to realize that, no, there's real tangible consequences that you get from deconstructing this. So to Stephen, the answer to your question is, first off, Coptic, very based. I have repeatedly said on this podcast, to the disappointment of some people, but I will continue to say so because I believe it is the truth. I think that the only positive return that you can see within a Christian tradition is either through the Catholic, Orthodox, or Coptic traditions. I'm very anti-Protestant at this point, despite the fact that I grew up and was raised Protestant. I genuinely think the Reformation was a mistake at this point. And I think part of the reason is because Protestantism, by definition, was about a rebellion against authority, right? It was about a rebellion against the Catholic Church.
Well, there were a lot of
course there were a lot of problems,
things that were nailed to that
the Council
door.
of Trent brought this up as well. It wasn't that there weren't Catholics that recognized that there were huge problems with like the selling of indulgences. There was corruption within the church. All of that stuff has been recognized by Catholics. But what we did within the Protestant Reformation, and you see it play out even today in the West in Protestant countries like the United States, is you have an infinite splittering and splintering and schisms that pop up over and over and over again. What you did is that you deconnected religion from the sacred, hierarchical, and traditionalist structures that actually provide meaning and grounding and orient that religion towards the divine. Once you deconstruct these things, Protestantism chucked all of that out the window. The Reformation chucked all of that out the window, and it said, we don't need any sort of sacred, hierarchical, or traditionalist structure in order to connect with the divine. I would argue that that's actually part of the reason that you got wokeism. It goes back to Elon's point. Atheism left an empty space. Secular religion took its place. You didn't see wokeism pop out of Ukraine and Greece and Egypt, places that have Coptic obviously Egypt's majority Muslim, but Egypt is Coptic, Ukraine is in Greece are Orthodox, Italy is Catholic. You didn't see wokeism pop out of those places. You may not
see wokeism.
You saw wokeism pop up in the US and the UK. These are Protestant countries. You saw wokeism get a stranglehold in Scandinavia.
I'm going to push back just a little. Okay, I'm going to push back just a little bit. Okay? Different tactics will be used in different ways, okay? The common thread here is a common hatred of Christ, and that's going to manifest itself in whichever way it can, in any place it can. So in some of these other countries where wokeism wasn't the tool the enemy used, and when I say enemy, I say Satan, okay? Wokeism may not be the tool that he used there, but he used it here, right? Well, he uses different tools there. Do you not see that there are different problems that those places have that are anti-Christ?
But the ultimate problem, and to try to get us back onto the track
back on track
of the topic of the podcast here, because I know that we're already at an hour 45 in. The ultimate problem is that you have got, as I said earlier, we live in an age of disillusion. The traditional bonds that have held people together and provided a grounding for finding meaning and purpose in your day-to-day life, those things are gone. And I think that's actually part of the reason why you've seen women veer towards the left very rapidly in a very short amount of time. We talked about earlier that actually, if you go far enough back, women were voting on the right of men.
And much of that is
ago.
due to women used to be more religious than men.
And I think,
how many times did y'all go to church on Mother's Day just so that your mom would be happy? Okay? It was the women bringing everybody in to keep them on the straight and narrow, right? Well, that's no longer a thing now because women have been told to become inferior men.
Well, and so what happens, these defense mechanisms that women have, the GSR stuff, when those are properly applied to preserve a civilization, they're positive things. I think that's how you get circumstances where women are more conservative leaning than men. But when you've dissolved those social bonds, when you've dissolved civilization itself, you're not going to get rid of the GSR because that's hardwired into them for the same reason that a preponderance towards violence is hardwired into men. Does that mean that men are going to always be violent, right? You have any sort of disagreement, and does that mean that Nick and I are going to beat each other? Nick would definitely beat me up. He's an ex-Green Beret. But point is that, like, when Nick and I disagree, are we going to draw swords? No. But the fact of the matter is that by nature of being men, Nick and I are more likely to draw the sword if it gets to that point. Likewise, when a disagreement happens, women are more likely to rely on GSR when it gets to that point.
Right.
That does not mean that we're always going to apply violence or that we're always going to apply GSR. That just simply means that we're more predisposed to it. And so when you dissolve the social bonds that allow for a civilization to form, when you dissolve the things that provide meaning and purpose, when you invert the natural-oriented flourishing that men and women have when they work together, that complementary nature, the old Spangler quote that we are meant for each other in all times and all places.
Right.
When you destroy all of those things, you're not going to get rid of the GSR. That's never going to go away.
Yeah, it's hardwired in.
Any more than the hardwiring towards violence. You can never, and the liberal society that we live in is trying to eradicate that. They're trying to raise men to be like women. They're trying to say aggressiveness is wrong. Being masculine is wrong. It's toxic masculinity.
Get in touch with your feminine side.
Get in touch with your feminine side.
Cry it out.
Reject this type of stuff. You can't eradicate it. The only way you could eradicate it is if you just exterminated men, which apparently some radical leftists actually want. But like, you can't get rid of it any more than you can get rid of the GSR. It's hardwired into women for the same reason that a preponderance towards violence is hardwired into men. And so all that you can do is you can orient it towards a positive end. You can be aggressive. You can be masculine. You can be, dare I say it, violent towards protecting that which you love, towards defending and building civilization. Mm-hmm. Likewise, you can engage in these tactics, and we've articulated them in a very negative way because they're currently manifesting themselves in a negative way.
Right.
But you can engage in these more feminine tactics to defend civilization, to raise children up. I don't mean you engage in gossiping, shaming, and rallying to raise children.
Well, and
I mean
the
the more nurturing feminine side of addressing conflict, of addressing challenges.
Yeah.
You can apply those in a positive way to raise children. You can apply those in a positive way to keep men in check, to civilize men, as I said earlier, because women do civilize men. But when you dissolve all of these social bonds that allow for civilization to grow, you're not going to get rid of the female impulse to address these challenges any more than you can get rid of the male impulse to address these challenges. All that you've done is you've eliminated any positive manifestation for these things to manifest themselves.
Right.
And so all that you have left now is a negative manifestation of it. A good example of this is men actually being violent, is men actually saying, I've got nothing to live for, so you know what? I'm going to go out there and commit a bunch of crimes. When men lose everything and they have nothing left to lose, they do some really, really ugly stuff. When women have nothing left to lose, they become, well, what we are currently seeing. They become leftist women.
Well, and I'm going to kind of pause that for just a second and say, I was having a conversation with Nick, and I was talking about how I have no goodwill left in me toward the left. I see it as such a mind virus. I see the ideology as so destructive and damaging to humans. I mean, you look, the women on the left are in crisis. You look at their mental health, you know, and it's seeping into the rest of society, and their men are pretty destroyed as well. It's just a mess. And I'm not saying, I'm not trying to confuse causation and correlation here, but when you line everything up and you start stacking the evidence, if you will, you can really see that it's the ideology that's doing this to them, and they don't even know it. They're so sold out, so invested in it. And I was talking to Nick, and I was saying, you know, I've gotten to the point now where it's like, well, can you be, you're either ignorant that this is happening, or you're complicit to it. And that makes you evil. Like, either if you know the truth, but you're not willing to abide by the truth. And if you know that something is damaging, but you're going to do it anyway because that's what society says is good, you know, let's just cut perfectly healthy sex organs off of people because that's going to make them feel better, and it's all about making them feel better. That's damaging. It's not good. And I'm not even going to draw the line at, oh, if you're an adult and you want to go have gender surgery, well, that's up to you. Just don't do it to the kids. No, I'm going to say this is damaging to everybody. Everybody. And it's being perpetuated through the school systems all the way up, and it's affecting people who are prone to mental illness more than it's affecting anybody. In fact, the groupings of transgendered youth, a huge majority of the transgendered youth are actually autistic and have been diagnosed before all of that with autism. And they're much more prone to certain activities like obsessive behavior and things like that. And when you offer this up as a solution, all you're doing is breaking them more. And I don't care if they're an adult or a child, you're breaking these people. And I get to the point where I will watch, the votes go up in the General Assembly, because I follow all of that a lot when Nick is voting and things like that. And it doesn't matter if the left knows that whatever this thing is, oh, this is bad, this is evil, we don't want to do these horrible things to kids, or we don't want porn in the schools. Well, just to let parents know whether or not it's there, you will watch every single Democrat click no on a bill that would allow for parents to know whether it's there or not. Like, they are the enemy at this point. And I told Nick, I'm like, I can't look at them and not see the enemy anymore. It used to be that, okay, we've got some Democrats who, they're just confused, maybe. Or they're actually kind of a moderate Democrat. You just don't even really have that anymore. And you do have some that can have like a reasonable conversation, but when the rubber meets the road, they will protect themselves with the herd. They will vote in that mob mentality way. And that's one of the reasons why you can see so much flip-flopping on the left. That's why, Bill Clinton used to be incredibly conservative. If you look back at his recordings of him talking about the welfare state and talking about illegal immigration and everything else, within their worldview, it's whichever way the wind blows. Let's just trust the experts. And at some point you're complicit, and at some point you're complicit, and that makes you evil at that point. If you're doing evil and you're doing it because you think it's right, that's one thing. Because you don't realize it, you're still captured ideologically, you've been captured. You need to be rescued out of this, right? Well, I've gotten to the point where I'm like, where are those people that are potential to come out of that? And Nick is really good because he reminded me, look, Tina, there are a lot of people that we're listening to now who came out of that, who they were so sold on the leftist ideology, and now they're darn right conservative. Now they're on the right. And you see people like Elon Musk, who is clearly now on the right. Not in everything, obviously. There are some social issues he's not on the right on. But he's not going to look at you and lie to your face and say, oh, yeah, well, that's just a female penis. There is no female penis, you guys. You're either male or you're female. And even the brains operate differently. And so I had such a hard time sitting down to work on this outline because I have so much anger and so much disgust toward the left at this point because of all of the things they espouse. And I will look at some of the comments that we get and things like that. People that are maybe just curious about what we're talking about, but they've kind of bought the lie of the left a little bit and they're starting to come around. And I remember, like, we're doing this for a reason. We are trying to basically rescue people out of this ideology. And that's what needs to happen. I do believe that we need to have a return to the Christian faith. I will always say that. And, you know, this deconstructionism thing is a huge problem. But there have been some people that have deconstructed themselves out of Christianity and then reconstructed themselves back in. So all is not lost, okay? But I just wanted to just bring that up, that I have to struggle with these bad feelings toward leftists at this point, being too harsh. And Nick always brings me back, like puts my feet back on the ground, you know, and goes, Tina, we can't operate like that because our enemy is the ideology. We got to rescue people out of it. And there are some people that maybe they can't be rescued out of it, but we're supposed to operate as though they can be and try our best to do it. And that's one of the reasons why we do this. And we're running up against time here. And I think
this has been a great, I've always enjoyed, we only very rarely get to, like, just you and I. Yeah. We did one like last year in November where we talked about divisions within the left. And that was like a great conversation. It's always, I don't know, it's always interesting when it's just, because again, it's only like once in a blue moon that it's just you and I. Sometimes it's like just Nick and I because you're not available. But
well,
I liked this conversation.
I want to ask this as we wrap up. Christian, give people marching orders. We want to know how to fix this. Can you give them some marching orders?
Oh gosh. Okay. The black pill is there is no legislative fix. You're not going to vote your way out of this. I'm just sorry, you're not. That doesn't mean voting doesn't matter. In fact, you should. Apparently, a lot of people found some of my stuff about early voting data in Virginia. They're kind of excited about it. I'm sure that between now and the election, we'll do a podcast where we'll talk about the election. But
you're not going to vote your way out of it overnight. But
no. Well, I mean, you can.
But
make
engage
things worse
in the process, because that's going to be one of my issues.
The way that I describe it is that the current liberal worldview is unworkable, and it literally cannot work. And so what's going to happen is there will be a course correction inevitably. Nature always, and the battle between delusional ideas and nature wins every single time. The question is, how painful will it be before nature reasserts itself and wins? And if we vote wrong, right? If we continue to defy what reality is and continue to pretend that we can just vote our way in ignoring reality, it will be very painful. And so that's why I'm saying that it's not like voting can save you, but that doesn't mean don't vote. By all means, absolutely vote. Vote for the right people. Vote against the insanity, because we want to make it as less painful or as least painful as possible in order for us to get through this. But first piece of advice, which is a bit of a black pill, although I would argue that there's maybe a white pill underneath it, which is you can't vote your way out of this problem. You know, there's this saying, I can't remember where it originates from, but there's this saying that comes from the Indian subcontinent. And the story or the analogy goes something like this, that when you're confronted with a tiger that wants to eat you, sometimes the only thing that you can do is jump on its back and ride it out until it exhausts itself, until it wears itself out. And so we're at a point now where the only thing that you can do on some of these fronts, and today we talked about this mental illness pandemic. We've talked about some of the crazy stuff that's coming out of academia, and we've talked about how this has particularly hurt women and men, but through women. Ultimately, I think that the only solution to some of these problems, not all of them, is to just ride it out, is to ride the tiger out. And because it will exhaust itself. This is unsustainable. I will end with this. This is unsustainable. You can't have a society where half of the population identifies on the left, and within that group, half of the population has a mental illness, and then they're voting to impose their delusions on society. That's not sustainable in the long run. And we know it's not sustainable. We also know why it's happening. We know that these social bonds have been dissolved. We know that we've lost touch with the things that give ultimate meaning and purpose. And you can't legislate your way into rebuilding those things. The left wants to do that. That's what socialism is all about, right? It's neighborliness. That's what Tim Walz says. like it is it's a fake substitute for an organic set of social bonds. You cannot legislate social bonds into existence. You can only build them organically. Well, they're gone now. And so what do we have to do? We need to start laying bricks. And we can't expect anybody else to do it other than ourselves. So we got to ride the tiger out. We got to wait for this to exhaust itself. And in the meantime, we need to start building something that can last. And that starts with not letting the craziness of the world demoralize you, and realize that, look, I can't control what a 23-year-old, female on the left who believes that men can become women and wants to impose that as a matter of law. I can't change her mind, probably. But you know what? I can insulate myself from the damage of the type of worldview that's going to end up imposing on things. And that starts with not just myself as an atomized individual. That starts with like-minded people. This is why Nick is so big into the whole intentional communities thing. This is also why I answered some of these super chats and said, no, you need a return to religion, but not just a return to religion. You need community through religion. That's why I said the Coptic Church, the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, those are the ones that I'm looking at more so than the Protestant churches in order to fill that void. So that's my long-winded answer. It's not a perfect solution, but it starts with building community and just riding out the storm.
Well, I would say that, there's a lot of guys that are super demoralized. They can't find, a woman who believes the same things as him. And I'm going to agree that they're a lot farther and fewer between. But if you look at some of these charts on conservative female voters, they're still there. There's not a ton of them, but you still have about, 40% of women almost that they're out there. And you need to find them. And I will say this, oftentimes I will see people in the chat that are like, I can't find anybody, blah, blah, blah. And you will hear men and women both saying that in the chat. And we have a pretty, I guess our YouTube audience is a little male heavy, but there are a lot of women that listen to it too. I think we have like 45% female or something. So
it's majority on Instagram.
On Instagram, it's a majority. Well, it was a majority female. So it's a pretty even split, you guys. Just find each other. You're all in the chat. Come on.
Are we going to have to launch the MTA dating service?
Yeah, but I just kind of want to go.
Jonam and Rosanna met through our podcast.
Right. But we've got men and women who are both saying, I can't find someone. And it's like, well, you're both here. Come on, find each other. But if you can't preserve it for the country at this point, at least preserve it for yourself and aspire to it. You can't give up. You can't. And I know that that's a hard thing to hear when it's like things just suck so bad. I don't see a way out. All you can do is the best you can do. Like do what, become the person you can be proud of enough to present to somebody else, and hopefully that'll work out. And I can't guarantee it. But on the other side of this, if you look at the voter data, like male population is not that much less than female population. So there is no reason why women should be registered to vote 10% just about higher than men. There is no reason that should be the case. So I would say re-engage in the process. If people are going to start voting in block like that and it's men versus women, well, then you need to be team men and you need to go vote accordingly, because if that's what this is going to boil down to, you know, I mean, I'm a female, I'm voting on your side, you know, we're going to have people on either side doing this, but like, come on, guys, get registered to vote. And if you've got, obviously, if you're watching this, you're probably already registered to vote. You know, you guys care about this stuff, and that's why you watch. But if you're talking to folks that aren't really engaged and you could tell they're really upset with life, you know, maybe you can have some conversations and tell them the data about how many more women are voting than men. And if they don't like the way things are going, then they need to engage. They need to make their presence known on the other side of this. If it's going to be us and them, they better pick a side. Get on it. Otherwise, I don't want to hear you complain. You know, if you're not going to be a part of the process, then don't bitch about it.
Speaking of being part of the process, I got to read this off. I'm looking at the chat right now, and Peter Balco says, Christian, you should lead by example. Find some Republican girl for yourself. I'm available. I don't know what to say. Maybe I'll find somebody. We'll see. But look, I really liked this podcast. We talked about a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
You and I both have a habit of sometimes going off topic on things when we fall in love with a particular topic.
Yes.
But I do think that we were able to kind of wrap this up in a nice bow of what is the problem, what's going on, why is it happening, and what are some of the ways that we can address it. And unfortunately, not everything has a legislative or electoral fix, but that doesn't mean there's not something that you can do. So as we wrap up here, Tina, do you want to close this out here?
Well, that was it. I just really appreciate you all bearing with us. You know, I'm not Nick, and I mean, I want to provide value to our audience. It's really important to me. I really care about our audience, and I'm really bummed that I couldn't be a part of the chat today, but this is a lot of pressure. But thank you so much for bearing with us. You know, we still have a lot of people watching, and I'm just so glad you stuck with us, even though I'm not Nick, and he's much more fun to listen to and more fun to look at. And on Tuesday, he will be back, and I'm not quite sure what we're talking about just yet, but rest assured, it will be good. All right. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time on Making the Argument.